Welcome to the Modern Husbands Podcast, where any combination of Dr. Ross, Christian Sherrill, and Brian Page host national experts who share winning ideas to manage money and the home as a team. Today, we welcome the world-renowned Dr. Joshua Coleman. Dr. Coleman is a psychologist in private practice and senior fellow with the Council on Contemporary Families. He has written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, and more. He has been a frequent guest on the Today Show and NPR and has been featured on Sesame Street, 2020, and Good Morning America. Dr. Coleman is the author of The Lazy Husband. He understands the challenges husbands face as we try to be supportive spouses. In this episode, Dr. Coleman shares why husbands are often unfairly and unknowingly seen as lazy around the home and as caregivers, and how to break through the common barriers that stand in the way of working with your spouse to manage the home and your children as a team. Enjoy the show. Dr. Coleman, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
What inspired you to focus on the topic of men's involvement in parenting and housework in your book, The Lazy Husband?
Well, I have three children, twin boys, and everybody's grown, and a daughter from a prior marriage. And when my twins were young, I started writing a column for Twins magazine, and I kept getting these letters to me from these mothers saying, my darling husband, but it was all about the husband's laziness. And I kind of recognized myself in a lot of the complaints, sort of not really, my wife being upset with me, sort of the inequality in terms of how much I was doing versus how much she was doing. And she's also a psychologist, but she wasn't, she's working maybe a third as much as I was, but still, just recognizing that there was a big disparity between how much childcare and housework she was doing versus how much I was doing, and how much that was affecting our marriage in a negative way. And it wasn't really till I started to kind of change my evil ways and begin to pitch in more that my marriage got a lot better. And I realized that this is something that other men could benefit from.
So you and your wife are psychologists?
We are indeed, yes.
Wow. Is an argument like an academic duel? Do you have to come in with your A game?
Yeah, we learned a long time ago not to get into it. Well, this is your childhood. These are your father issues or your mother issues. We long ago banned that from the conversation. So,
do you bring in peer-reviewed research after your
Yeah, exactly right. According to the following study in the Journal of Personality, just proves my point. Yeah, no, we've sort of learned better to avoid that kind of debate. Doesn't really. I mean, just like in any marital argument, trying to prove yourself right is a dead end. So whether you've got facts behind it or not, it's just not going to work. So
truth.
What challenges do couples face when it comes to finding the balance and parenting and managing the household, particularly, men taking on more of those household chores and management tasks?
Yeah, I think one of the issues is that men aren't held to the same standards about how a house looks or how the children are raised. So, even if it's a stay-at-home dad, if little Janice or Jimmy goes to school with, peanut butter on their jeans or, a torn shirt, people aren't going to think, well, what is this father thinking? They're going to think, what is this mother thinking? Similarly, if people come over to the house and the house is a mess and the dad is the primary contributor to the mess, as I certainly am in my household, people are still going to hold the wife to a much higher standard because women is just still held to a higher standard. And so to that extent, men are kind of given a certain kind of a pass around both childcare and the way that the house looks. And so that can really inform who does what, because men just don't tend to value it as much. I mean, I really don't care if the house is a mess in the same way that my wife does. I mean, I care if my kids, go to the school with, dirty clothes or something. But in terms of their even psychologically, the way that men invest in children is different. I'm not going to say it's less because I just think it's qualitatively different than the way that mothers do. So those things can just by their nature create tensions in a marriage.
I feel guilty right now, Dr. Coleman, because
Sure.
in all seriousness, I'm
it's easy for me to be self-deprecating because I'm evolving. I've learned to use that language as a husband. But it does drive me a little bit nutty when, we're having company and, like she wants to clean the attic. Like it's like this nesting period that a
Right.
company's having company. And I never had considered that societal norms really push her to feel that way, and she feels pressured because she thinks, and could rightfully so, people are going to judge how clean her house is based on, they're going to judge her. They're
Yeah.
not going to judge, me, or they're not going to judge us as a team. So I'm glad you
Right.
brought that up because I need to be more understanding when it comes to that.
Yeah. And it is hard because, it can feel like, well, what's the big deal? I mean, literally, my wife will walk into the kitchen and go, oh, it's a mess. And I'm like, wait, where's the mess? But it's just a different kind of a criteria of what's considered a mess and what isn't. And she has a right to her criteria. So those things have to be sort of, sometimes argued, but discussed and come to some kind of a compromise around it if you're going to have a happy marriage.
Yep.
Do you ever feel, and I know we'll get to some more questions too, but do you ever feel like with your work, you're kind of swimming upstream against decades or generations of, inherited mindsets and habits? Like, how do you think about breaking through some of that?
Yeah, I think we still, we haven't yet relinquished kind of our ideals around masculinity that really for a long time, the ideals of masculinity were as protector and provider. And, and in terms of being the provider, that means primary role was an economic contribution to the family. And it really wasn't until, women began to, as a result of the liberalization of divorce laws, women could leave unhappy marriages as a result of birth control. Women could control their own reproductive power, reproduction. And so women didn't have to be married in order to have a sex life. So all those things changed marriage and really empowered women. And I wouldn't exactly say disempowered men, but certainly changed the power dynamic in marriage in ways that are still sort of ongoing and evolving, to use Brian's term. So a lot of men are still kind of confused, and a lot of women are as well, about sort of what is a man's role in the family, what is a real man. I read an article for AEON a while ago about the topic of why don't men write more essays about divorce, because there's so many divorce essays about women as divorce being sort of a path of liberation and the like. And one of the points that I made was that for men, and first of all, most of the time it's women who are leaving men rather than the other way around. But for men, kind of being vulnerable is still a very big challenge. And women also do a certain amount of gender policing. It's not, men are not the only ones that have to kind of come to the table. And so I quote excuse me, a cartoon I saw a while back that had two women in conversation, and one woman said to the other, well, I want a guy who will well up with tears. I just don't want one who will actually cry. And to me, that was such a perfect statement of this moment that I think women are also confused about, well, what is kind of like a real man? And also that means that masculinity, being a good man, being a good husband, being a good father, those are all still somewhat under construction. So I think people, both men and women, are confused about that.
Yeah, it makes me think a lot of kind of, and thinking of my own family and my own upbringing, but like intergenerational kind of patterns and like the values that like persist and get passed down. And I think of like, my grandmother was like, she did the white glove test when she used to visit for the holidays. Like, and like, yeah, like just crazy. And like, oh, you didn't clean this. Oh, this wasn't right. Like just pointed out blatantly.
Wow.
To everybody, but in particular, my mother.
Sure.
And so in like those values, like she's nowhere near as extreme, but get passed down.
Right.
And I think of even my own upbringing though, like both my parents, like they were very collaborative in their cleaning. And like my father loves getting down on his hands and knees and scrubbing baseboards and polishing silverware and stuff. Like, and so growing up in that, like, I just kind of learned, like, well, that's what a man does
Oh,
as well.
yeah.
And so I guess, yeah, part of maybe the misconceptions or the stereotypes, maybe we didn't have those role models or the values that were specifically passed down to us from higher generations.
I think that's right. And I see in my sons, I have twin boys, and they're much more participatory and much more egalitarian in their
Because they
relationship.
see you do it.
Yeah, they saw me do it, but they're actually even more so than I was. And probably because generationally, younger generations are millennials, Gen Z. They've been raised with a much more egalitarian model, so they're more likely to participate in that way. There's still a big disparity, particularly when couples become parents. Men still don't do quite as much housework or parenting as women do, but certainly more than prior generations. So you're right. The role modeling is a really important part of this.
So in your research, have you identified some like common misconceptions or stereotypes that do contribute then to this perceptions of husbands being quote unquote lazy in terms of the parenting and the housework?
So stereotypes meaning, well, if I understand the question, I mean, I think that for a lot of men, probably more working class men, although that's changing somewhat too, the idea of housework, even parenting, can be associated with, being somehow not masculine or, not being a real man. And I think even for educated men, that, as we're discussing, can still persist in some kind of ways. But there's other reasons that men don't participate, and some of it has to do with the wife's or mother's gatekeeping. There's a lot of research about maternal gatekeeping, both around parenting and housework. And if their standards are so high, most men will just walk away, whether it's parenting or housework. If the woman is so critical of it, or say, well, that's not how you hold the baby, or that's not what the kids need, or, okay, I'm going out now, but, you can't just let, Jimmy play, the baby play on the floor while you're watching the game. You need to get on the floor and read with them. I mean, that's all maternal gatekeeping in my perspective. And it's also wrong-headed, that dads need to be given the freedom to parent in the way that they see fit, and that the mom can't hold herself out as the ideal standard, or the guy, partly because of masculinity, partly because few people really like to be told what to do or how to parent, is just going to say, oh, well, if you have it all figured out, then you can do it. What do you need me for? And it can breed resentment. Whereas other research that shows that when women are much more collaborative and are much more willing to often to lower their standards, and men raise theirs, that's a much better model. So studies that show that early on, when moms can, practically from birth, hand the baby to the dad and say, here's the baby, go change the diaper. I don't know how to change the diaper. You'll figure it out, or I'll show you once, and then it's on you to do it. But moms who continually supervise, who micromanage, who criticize, that's a recipe for an unhappy marriage and a non-participatory dad, both in terms of parenting and housework.
We had Eve Rodsky on recently, and she brought up the same thing. And in her system, there are 3 key points, and one of them is boundaries. And she talked about this, and I experienced this as well, because we've evolved, and my wife used to do everything, and during that transition period, she was looking over my shoulder, kind of like micromanaging it, and it was a frustrating experience.
It is,
and I think for listeners who are trying to evolve themselves, they would benefit from understanding, how do you go about having a conversation with your spouse about establishing boundaries so you can do things in your own way without feeling judged, without having, as Dr. Ross was sharing earlier, the white glove test, every day in your household.
Yeah, right. No, it's a critically important conversation. And like most conversations where there's conflict or differences, you want to start, it's got to be a compliment sandwich, right? You have to start with what you love, admire, respect, or value about your partners. You can't come in going, I really don't like how you parent, or, you're really such a lazy slob, or I don't, you always leave the house a mess. It's far better to say, look, I really love this about you, or I know you're really involved. Let's say it's parenting. I know you love the kids, and the kids really love you. And I'm really glad that you're their dad. I'm wondering if we could brainstorm sort of, the way that we talk to them. I do sometimes, I know we're different, but I do sometimes feel the way that you talk to them is a lot more harsh than I feel comfortable with. So can we talk about that? Do you have any thoughts about that? Is there a way that we can work together around that? And the husband may feel criticized and say, well, you're just too sensitive. You're too reactive. They don't care. It's good for them. And the wife could say, well, you may be right, but it does bother me. So given that, I would like us to just brainstorm about it. Do you have thoughts about it? In other words, make it a collaborative conversation where both people have input about it, and that it's not a right or wrong kind of a conversation. As soon as you get into right or wrong territory, then, game over with almost any kind of human interaction. People are just going to get defensive, and they're just not going to want to be in a collaborative mindset. The goal is to establish the collaborative mindset. And that's why a compliment sandwich is always the best. You lead saying, we're partners here, we're peers, we're equals, you're great this way, this is my request, and then end with, well, maybe you won't resolve it at the end. But you can say, okay, well, let's keep thinking about it. I don't have a solution. Doesn't sound like you do either. I just want you to know how this is impacting me, and that I'd like you to be thinking about it more, that kind of a thing. So it's much more about more than the music than the lyrics. So it's much more often about the tone, and that set up rather than the content per se.
I could have used that wisdom a couple of years ago, Dr. Coleman, because that sounds like it would have worked better than telling my wife, so this is what a ball and chain feels like. That did not go very well.
Oh, trust me, I've had many choice conversations with my wife too over the years. So this is an evolved wisdom. So,
hey there, podcast fam. We'd love to hear from you. Please take this moment to rate and subscribe to our podcast. Your feedback fuels our passion to bring you more engaging content. And please text this episode to your friends. It's your support that can help us grow. Now back to the show.
What are some strategies to get husbands to, or men, I should say, to be doing more parenting and housework?
Well, there's an interesting study by John Gottman many years ago when I came out with my book, The Lazy Husband, which is what got me on all this media, where he showed that men who do more, I think it was just housework, have wives who are much more interested in sex. So that's, for most men, that's the selling point, because for in most marriages, not all, but in most marriages, men feel more sex deprived than do their wives. And that would be a whole other episode. But probably helping both sides to know that relationship, that for men, sex is a way to de-stress and a way to feel close. Whereas for most women, they don't want to be sexual if they're feeling stressed out. And for many moms in particular, the two things that stress them out the most are housework and parenting. So if a wife feels like the husband really is participating equally and taking a lot of stress off her back and being a really good partner and really being mindful of what she's thinking and feeling, she's going to, in all likelihood, not always, but in all likelihood, be much more interested in being physical with a guy than if she's feeling resentful and put upon and exhausted. So that's one idea. I think the main thing is maintaining the friendship of the relationship, because men get much more value than they ever have about being parents. So if you ask the average young father what's your core value, it says being a good dad. That said, men still don't typically in most households do as much parenting as the wives do, which means that if the wife wants the husband to be more involved in parenting or housework, they have to maintain the friendship. That has to be that's going to be the core motivator. The guy's going to want to do better as a husband and as a dad if he feels like his wife has his back and loves him and cares about him, than if he feels criticized or unappreciated or belittled or demeaned or that kind of thing. So, for example, I probably made it clear that I'm the sloppier one between my wife and I. So, if I'm about to leave the house and there's dishes in the sink, I don't give a damn if there's dishes in the sink. That's not going to ruin my day. And I don't care if there's dishes in the sink when I go to bed. I won't even think about it. But I know it bugs the crap out of my wife. And my wife's a nice person. And I know if, at this point, I'm motivated to make her happy because when she's happy, she's just nicer to me than she is when she's unhappy. So that becomes a big motivator for me to do the dishes. So I'm doing them really in my mind, I'm doing them for her. I mean, she might say, oh, you're doing it for the house, but I don't, again, I don't give a shit about the house being messy, but she does. And so the key motivator is wanting her to be happy. So how can wives be more likely to motivate their husbands? There was a good article in the New York Times probably a decade ago about what Shamu taught me about marriage. It was written by a woman who observed large animal trainers, and she found that when a large animal trainer was working with Shamu, the killer whale,
Big killer whale, yeah,
a marine world, and that the trainer only used positive reinforcement. That was the only thing they did. They only talked about the positive. And in parenting, we call it catch your child doing something right. Well, that also works in marriage really, really well. So I often encourage the wives in my practice to just focus on the positive, reinforce the things that you really like. Men are in some ways more sensitive to criticism because of the way that it affects our feelings of masculinity. Whereas for women, sometimes when men complain about them in marriage, they feel like, oh, he cares about the marriage. He wants us to have a better marriage. I mean, assuming he's not doing it in some, totally dickish way. So motivating through friendship, through appreciation, through catching him doing something right, through, really valuing the ways that he does contribute, that if you do the complaint, to do it in a positive way, to complain. If you do have a complaint, to rank it on a scale of 1 to 10, if it's like a trivial thing, look, this is a 2, but can we work on this together? Whereas if it's a 10, then you got to say it's a 10. If it's like, look, if you don't change your habits around this, I can't live with you. I'm actually thinking about divorce. I mean, that conversation has to happen in homes as well. And because these issues, if left untended, do end up in divorce. If there is this huge disparity in housework and parenting and the way it kind of enfolds other issues, get sort of sucked down into it. So really maintaining the core friendship is really the biggest motivator. But also, and this is also John Gottman's research at the University of Washington, really having discussions about core values, because couples aren't always aligned about what their core values are. So really understanding each other's values, why this is important to that person, why being a good parent, or why it's less important, or other things are more important. Like, for some dads, really being a good, big breadwinner might be a bigger value to them, certainly, than a clean house, but maybe even being a great parent. Maybe they grew up in poverty and they felt like, gee, I wish I'd had somebody who took care of me financially. To me, that's a huge value. So really valuing that rather than criticizing it. Valuing it doesn't mean you surrender all your authority to it as the other partner. It just means that you appreciate it so that other person feels seen and heard, and then you can negotiate from there.
So it makes me think of like this concept of emotional labor. And so how does this concept then play into our division of responsibilities? And so I guess also how couples can address and distribute it then more equitably.
Yeah. So emotional labor, for those who don't know, is the notion of kind of the, what the other person is thinking and feeling. And the research shows that that for women, it's a key value. Like if you ask women, what's the most important thing for you in marriage? It's how much emotional labor the guy does. And that means how empathic he is, how tuned into her feelings he is, how sensitive, how collaborative, how caring, and that sort of, from that perspective. So men tend to have better marriages if they do more emotional labor, can learn to be more empathic and caretaking and the like. And men, in general, don't kind of come into marriage as good at that, in part because parents, even to this day, the research shows parents, both mothers and fathers, don't use as much emotional language with boys. They still have, even in kind of more, egalitarian, so-called liberated households, still have a somewhat more discomfort around boys who cry, who show their feelings. Boys get less touch than girls do. So men often come into marriage more compromised in terms of not only their abilities to be empathic, but also their own awareness of their own emotions. So I often find in my couples work that I have to kind of help guys really establish their own authority about their own feelings. I feel like it's okay to advocate for yourself, and that there's a way to do it there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it, but that it is okay to advocate for yourself, because so many men don't feel that way. And so they come into marriage in some ways disempowered, and they come into couples therapy also feeling fearful because they feel like they're on thin ice and foreign terrain, because they feel like, oh, this is going to be my wife's domain because she's really good at emotions and language and psychology, and I'm really not. So as a culture and a society, being more empathic to the way that men come into marriage often not as able to do the emotional labor, and for women to be more either forgiving about that or to be helpful in a way that isn't sort of patronizing and gatekeeping.
The norm in television shows and in movies is that the man comes home and he's had a bad day at work. Just take, for instance, The Sopranos at the extreme end, right? A gangster
Right.
comes home and he's had a terrible day at work.
I've been rewatching, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, he's probably off somebody, but he's kind of unloading, and his wife takes the role of being kind of sympathetic or whatever. And so growing up, that's what we see as kids, or even that's what we watch as adults. But the world's different now, because in most households, there's two working adults, and we've had conversations with many of those, and Christian's one of them, where his wife has a big job, right? She's an emergency medicine physician, and have another advisory board member where he's at Treasury, but she's a senior tax advisor at ExxonMobil, and so they come home, they've had bad jobs, and what seems to be or hard jobs, and what seems to be consistent is that just like we want to unload, sometimes they want to unload. And, they've had a bad day at work. And I don't recall which podcast guest brought this up, but just the idea of just coming in, and if you need to de-stress or talk to your spouse, just to ask the question to your spouse before they, start kind of talking about their day is, do you want space? Do you want a solution? Or do you simply want to vent? Because ultimately, and I'm guilty of this, and many men are, we rush straight to just trying to solve the problem. Where, frankly,
Absolutely.
Sometimes I don't want the problem solved. When I'm venting, I just want to kind of, I'm like a tea kettle. I just want to kind of let it go. And I felt like that was really good advice, just to know from the word go, or do you want some space when we leave you alone? Do you want a solution, or you just want to vent? And that seemed like what women were telling us is that has been really beneficial in their marriages.
Yeah. No, I think that's great advice, to ask what the person needs and not to rush in to fix it. And I do think of it as a very, common gender difference, that men are much more geared towards, well, it's a problem, let's solve it. Why just talking about it isn't solving it? What's the advantage to that? And it's certainly something that I had to learn, to just shut up and listen and be empathic, and poor baby, or that sounds tough, and to ally with your partner rather than the other person. It can be tempting, particularly if you're in fix-it mode, to go, well, did you try saying this to your, employee or your boss or whatever? Maybe next time you should do X, Y, or Z. And that's just makes your partner feel more unheard. And it's far better to just be on their side and be empathic and hear them out. Or, if they want to be, maybe they do want advice. So that's fine, but not to assume that. I think your example, Brian, of being the tea kettle. Yeah, sometimes you just want to just vent and get it all out of your system. Then maybe you're going to be open for feedback, and maybe not. Maybe that's all you need.
Hey listeners, this is a shout out for a great podcast to consider, For Fox's Sake. They give zero fucks about money shame and talk about real life and finance, including the taboo behind it all. Check them out on Apple Podcast. Now back to the show.
Can you talk about creating a supportive environment to take on more of these responsibilities? I know we've already sort of alluded to a lot of these elements, but yeah, what's the environment look like for, in a partnership where, a man is taking on more of these tasks?
I mean, I think, empathy is really the key ingredient. Empathy and really knowing your partner's psychology to the best of your ability. So, for example, in my marriage, my wife's dad was a huge guilt tripper. He was a good guy, but he's a massive guilt tripper. And so my wife has very little immunity to guilt trips. And, if I'm really mad, I can certainly throw some serious guilt shade, at her. At least I used to, until I learned how much it didn't really serve me. Not saying I never do it, but I don't do it nearly as much as I used to. So knowing her psychology is really important. Everybody has vulnerabilities, areas where they have wounds or even traumas. And so the more deeply you understand those and can kind of be sensitive to those, the better. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't, because some spouses will be manipulative around that. It's kind of like, well, that's what my father would say, or that's what my mother would say. And it's sort of like you're not allowed to sort of say things that really bother you. And there has to be room in every marriage for, there has to be kind of a spirit of safety for people to complain about the things that really bother them. Because some marriages die by a death of 1,000 cuts. It's the little things that aren't said over the years that build up and build up and build up till those are whole in the center of the marriage. So there has to be a kind of a commitment to creating a safe environment where you can complain about the things that bother you. But again, going back to John Gottman's research, Gottman found that it has to be a ratio of 5 positive to 1 negative. That for every, complaint or criticism or fight you have, there's got to be 5 positive experiences. That doesn't mean some massive thing like, flowers or taking your, wife out to dinner or giving her husband a massage. It's more just, maybe it's a compliment, maybe it's a hug, maybe it's an apology, but something that's much more in the spirit of repair. So really being sensitive to who your partner is, but also having the freedom and the courage to complain about the things that bother you, and the strength to hear your partner's complaints about you. None of us likes to hear the complaints that our spouses have about us, but it's really critical to be able to do it. But it's also critical to do it in a way that isn't a criticism. That's a complaint. The difference is that a complaint has at its core an I statement. A criticism would be, you're such a lazy husband. An I statement would be, when you don't do the dishes, I feel resentful, or I feel taken advantage of, or I feel like, I'm having to do more than is my fair share. That's an I statement. And that it avoids contempt. Contempt, we know, is like the biggest poison in a marriage. That the couples have ongoing contempt are much more likely to end in divorce. So really trying to keep the marriage, is insulated from those more toxic influences, the better. And to be clear, one of the toxic influences is being too conflict avoidant. So you have to be kind of courageous enough both to complain about the things that bother you, but also courageous enough to tolerate the complaints your spouse has about you, but then have that all surrounded by a good, solid friendship with your partner where you understand their psychology and you're committed to their happiness and well-being and that kind of thing.
So it's been all just fascinating and great information you provided. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your work and purchase your books?
Sure. They can go to my website at www.drjoshuacoleman.com. That's drjoshuacoleman.com. And you can purchase my books either there or through Amazon and that kind of thing. I mean, these days I'm specializing much more around parental estrangement. So, we're helping parents whose adult children don't talk to them anymore. So my site is sort of evolved more into that space. But
we'll have to have you back on to talk about that.
Sure. No, happy to. Yeah.
What is one piece of simple and actionable advice you want our listeners to walk away knowing from today's episode?
I think the power of appreciation, that people are much more motivated by appreciation and love and affection and valuing than they are by criticism or hostility or negativity. It can feel like, if I'm just hard enough on my partner, they're going to see how unhappy I am and they're going to be more motivated to change. But people aren't motivated to change that way. But you also have to not be so conflict avoidant that you don't let your partner know the things that are bothering you. So it's really the twin of those two, being very appreciative, but also being very clear about what your values are and what is really important to you, and kind of trying to meld those two together.
Dr. Coleman, your wisdom today, I wish I would have had it a few years ago, but I'm glad we have it now and our listeners have it now. Thank you for joining us.
Great. No, it was a pleasure. It was fun to talk to all of you.
A special thanks to our guest and, of course, to all of our listeners. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcast, give us a rating, and share the Modern Husbands podcast with others. Doing so goes a long way in growing our reach. And join your fellow modern husbands and have links to our podcasts, articles, and other resources to manage money in the home as a team sent to your inbox every 2 weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.